In this episode, I am speaking to one of the world's foremost experts in neurotheology, the neuroscience of religion. It's Dr. Andrew Newberg. Newberg has been studying how religion affects the brain for more than 30 years and has published several books on the topic. We shall talk about how he does his research, what actually happens in the brain during spiritual practice, and you'll hear some insights that might surprise you.
But the interesting thing about rituals in animals is that they're all mating rituals. And so it makes sense that the rituals that ultimately evolved into human beings are probably connected to mating processes themselves.
Today on What is Mind, religion and the brain. Dr. Andrew Newberg, welcome to What is Mind.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on the program.
You measure the brain activity of people in your research, and we'll talk about how you do that in a while. But let's just jump right into the results right away. What are the similarities and differences between what goes on in the brain of a Buddhist monk and a Christian nun when they are in practice?
Well, it's a really interesting question. It's something that, as you alluded to, I've been actually studying for the last 30 years or so. Um, I think there's a couple ways of answering the question. First of all, I think one thing that's really important for the audience to understand is that there isn't just one part of our brain that turns on when a person starts to pray or meditate or whatever. There are lots of different parts of the brain that become involved, and in fact, depending on how much detail we ultimately decide to get into, there are many different structures. There's lots of different parts of the brain, and actually, for anyone who does have, comes from some type of religious or spiritual tradition, they understand that there's emotions, there's thoughts, there's feelings, there's different experiences, and so forth. So it is very multifaceted, and in many ways shouldn't be a surprise that it engages many different parts of our brain. Now, that being said, I think that the similarities and the differences that we see across different traditions are also a little challenging to truly tease out because um, so many times when we do our studies, we're looking at a specific kind of practice. And so the answer to the question about the similarities and differences seems to depend a little bit more on what is the person doing and experiencing rather than what the tradition is that they come from. So to give you like a very specific example, when we studied Buddhist meditators and when we studied Franciscan nuns in prayer, there were certain things that they did in similar kinds of ways. They were both concentrating on their practice. They were in the Buddhist meditators, they were concentrating on a visual image. And when we look at the Franciscan nuns, they're concentrating on a prayer. So they're both concentrating and focusing their attention on it. And so there's an area of our brain, the frontal lobe, right behind our frontal, the forehead, that becomes activated when a person starts to do that. So we see that similarity, for example, across these two different practices and these two different traditions. Now, we also saw some distinctions because the prayer practice was a verbal practice. So they're repeating a prayer or a phrase from the Bible or something like that. Whereas the Buddhist meditators were focusing on an image. So it was more visually oriented. And in that sense, we see differences. So in the Buddhist meditators, we see changes going on in the back of the brain, the occipital lobe, where the visual centers are. And we see changes in the language areas along the side of the brain and temporal lobe that we saw in the nuns, but we don't see so much in the Buddhist meditators. So, there's this whole network of structures, but how you begin to access it really does depend on what exactly you're doing and to some degree what you ultimately feel. And by that, I mean, if you have a highly emotional experience, maybe a nun feels a great sense of joy, well, they're going to activate the emotional centers of the brain, like the limbic system. But if the Buddhist meditators have more of a, not really much of an emotional response, but more of a sense of spacelessness or timelessness or oneness or something like that, then there's areas of the brain that are involved in that sense of oneness, an area of the brain, the parietal lobe in the back of the brain, that seems to be more involved with that kind of an experience. So again, it becomes very interesting because there's lots of different parts of the brain that all get involved depending on what the person is doing.
Okay. And one part of the brain that is going on nearly all the time we don't have anything to do is the default mode network, right? It's
Right.
the storifying part of our brain. Uh, how does that behave during spiritual practice and afterwards? Uh, when you get more towards a sort of a baseline state.
Well, that's also interesting. So, there have been people who have looked at neuroscience now is leaning more and more towards kind of network neuroscience. And so we do talk about the default mode network and the salience network and other networks in the brain. Interestingly, I mean, I'll take a little bit of indirect credit for some of this because many years ago, our very first papers that we came out with back in the early 90s kind of talked about a network. We didn't call it a network, but but did talk about this overall interaction of these different structures and how they operate and what's going on at rest versus what's happening when you begin to activate this network in different ways. And another really important point about all of this is that some structures will have increases of activity, some structures will have decreases of activity. And so, as you mentioned, the default mode network is what kind of comes on when we're not doing anything in particular, and then kind of quiets down when we are actively engaged in some kind of task like meditation or prayer. And that, to some degree, is what we have seen in our studies. Again, we tend to look at it a little bit more structure by structure as opposed to network by network. But there are other investigators who have explored these practices and have found that as the practice begins, there is kind of a quieting down of the default mode network, and then what we also see is that over time. There are changes in some of these structures and in some of these networks that may underlie some of the actual clinical effects that have been reported. So, for example, one of the classic things that meditation seems to be used for, at least on a secular level, is reducing stress and reducing anxiety. And so areas of the brain that help to modulate anxiety, like the frontal lobes and another structure called the anterior cingulate, these are areas that tend to have a little bit higher activity, even when the person is no longer doing the practice, but it kind of changes the way they operate, even at rest. And then some of the emotional areas of the brain, like the limbic system, actually start to quiet down. So we start to see some baseline changes in how the brain is operating. And in fact, actually, a little bit, the analogy that I often use is to sort of think about the brain a bit as a muscle, and that meditation and these kinds of spiritual practices are exercises for the brain, so to speak, that the more you do them, the more the brain actually does change. And there are some very interesting studies that have shown that, much like a muscle, if you do exercise, the brain actually gets bigger, like a muscle gets bigger, and in some sense gets stronger. It has kind of baseline more activity in some of these areas, especially some of those areas that are part of the default mode network, which kind of implies that they kind of work a little bit better. We've seen some correlations between the amount of activity that the baseline activity in these areas after meditation that correlates with improvements in cognition and depression and anxiety. So it's all part of kind of understanding the clinical effects as well as the direct physiological effects.
Okay, so let me kind of combine the couple of my questions there. We talked about that baseline afterwards. Is there some kind of similarity, do you think, in what the neuronal activity is in deeply religious people, say, whether they be Buddhist or Christian or Muslim or whatever?
Well, this is where it gets a little bit more difficult to know because
Mm,
there is so much just natural variability in human beings.
right.
And so, there have been some studies that have shown that, compared non-religious people to religious people or something like that, and they see some statistically different effects, but there's also a lot of overlap. So my guess is that it's a very, much like everything with the brain, it's very multifactorial. There's lots of different things that are different that are going on. And it's not, again, it's not just like can't just answer that this is the area that is involved or is different that makes somebody a religious person versus somebody who's not. And I suspect that it does have a lot to do with the networks and how they are interconnected with each other. One of the other areas, and I wasn't sure exactly where you might be heading with this question, but I'll take the opportunity to talk about
Sure.
this other piece of this, which is, not just the connectivity that we see in the brain, but the function of the neurons down to the sort of the neurotransmitter level. And we did a very interesting study several years ago where we took people through a spiritual retreat program. And what we found is that by doing a lot of meditation and prayer over a relatively short period of time, about a week or so, it altered the way their brain responded to serotonin and dopamine, two very critical neurotransmitters that help to create, our thoughts and our emotions and so forth that help us with all of that. And basically, what it showed was that these kinds of practices made the brains more sensitive to the effects of these different neurotransmitters. And again,
Mm.
this is very interesting because dopamine is kind of the reward molecule. So it's involved in making us feel good, making us feel positive and happy. And serotonin is involved a lot with emotional states like depression and anxiety. The drugs that we use to help with those specifically affect the serotonin system, the well-known drugs like Prozac and Zoloft and so forth. So I suspect that part of the answer to your question about religious versus non-religious individuals has something to do with the overall network and connectivity that's going on in the brain itself and how we begin to see various patterns and understandings about the world. But there may also be some element of the different neurotransmitters, how we feel about the world in certain ways, how we try to interpret the world, and ultimately how we experience the world. So, but there again, it's always a little bit of a hard question for me to answer because I always feel like there's so much overlap that you might find out that people who are religious have less frontal lobe activity than people who are non-religious or something like that. But there's still people who are religious who have heightened frontal lobe, and there's so there's a lot of overlap, and I think we certainly have a bit of a ways to go before we can kind of hone in on exactly what's going on and what really contributes to somebody believing one way or another. And then again, I mean, even beyond that. Part of the challenge of even answering that question is that even within a religion, people look at it differently. Like if you go to an adherent of maybe an evangelical Christian church who might have a lot of emotional, connection with the church and the Bible and Jesus and so forth, it's a highly emotional kind of belief system for them. If you talk to a Catholic theologian who is highly analytical and philosophical and looks at and can quote Descartes and Aristotle and Nietzsche and all this. That's a that's a much more cognitively oriented person. So again, even there, it's not like each person has their there's one way of being religious even within a given tradition, and so that also is part of what makes it very complex. I think it's always going to be very difficult, and in my own perspective and models of these kinds of phenomena, I typically try to look at these complex models of it because I feel like you almost need these complex models to be able to explain the complex properties and elements of these phenomena.
Tell
Right.
us about how you do your research, the actual techniques you use for seeing the activity in the brain.
Well, so, I kind of grew up as a medical doctor in the field of imaging. And the good news is that there's a lot of different ways of doing imaging of the brain. And as one of my old mentors used to say, that if you're a good carpenter, you have a lot of tools in your bucket. And so
Mm.
it's good to have a lot of different ways of doing that. Part of what I like about this field of neurotheology, are the methodological challenges. In fact, in a book I published about 15 years ago now called Principles of Neurotheology, I do talk about the challenges of developing studies, and part of the reason for those challenges is that each type of practice or belief or or tradition kind of has different ways of doing things. So the first step really is to understand what it is that you want to look at. What are you going to explore? Is it going to be a meditation practice? Is it going to be prayer? Is it going to be a belief system? Is it, what exactly is it that the person is going to do? And then you need to find out all the different components of that. So are they going to have their eyes open? Are they going to have their eyes closed? Are they going to be speaking? Are they going to be looking? What are they going to be doing? And when they're doing that, there are a lot of different issues that come up for us to be able to figure out how to design our study, because part of the other piece before we even get them into the scanner is what is the state that you're trying to capture, and how can you look at what is unique about the religious or spiritual aspect of that? And what I mean by that is that let's say we want to capture somebody reading the Bible. Well, I can't compare reading the Bible to doing nothing. Obviously, there's going to be all kinds of changes because they're reading. And if they were reading, the newspaper or reading a comic book or whatever, there would be similar kinds of changes because they are reading, and that's different than if they are, just doing nothing at all. So, the next question then is, what exactly are they doing? How are they going to engage this particular practice? How long is the practice? I mean, I can't, if this practice takes 10 minutes is a different kind of thing that I have to think about than if it takes an hour or 3 hours or something like
Mm.
that. And then ultimately, we have to figure out the specific kind of scan or scanner that we want to use. And so, a lot of our studies, we've already talked about some of them, the Buddhist meditators and the Franciscan nuns, used a kind of imaging called SPECT imaging, which stands for single photon emission computed tomography. And it's a nuclear medicine technique where we inject a small amount of a radioactive tracer that circulates briefly, gets up into the brain, and shows us some part of the brain's physiology. And so, one of the main tracers that we use is a tracer that follows blood flow in the brain. And the reason that that works so well is that, as I mentioned, you inject it, and after it circulates, it kind of gets up into the brain, and it stays wherever it goes for at least, a period of time. So I can inject somebody, let's say, who's listening to the podcast right now, let them finish the podcast, maybe grab a quick snack, and then drive over to their the local hospital, get into the scanner, and it'll show me what their brain was doing right now while they were listening to the podcast. So we
Mhm.
can inject them while they're doing meditation. We can inject them while they're doing prayer, and then put them into the scanner afterwards, but it shows you what was happening at the moment that they were doing the practice. And that's particularly helpful for practices where people have to be in a certain posture or have to be, maybe moving around or something like that. Whereas we have also used MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, which is a wonderful approach to use, but you kind of have to be in the scanner to be able to see what's going on. And so you'd have to at least make sure that they could do this practice while they were in the scanner itself. And there are some practices where a person can just lie there quietly and just kind of do the scan. But again, if they're saying something out loud or if they need to be moving around, then an MRI scanner is not the approach that we can use. So it really does depend a lot on what the practice is, and then we try to apply, the specific kind of imaging tools and instruments to be able to look at what that practice is. And sometimes we do other kinds of study. Sometimes we'll do a pre versus a post. So maybe we're not trying to capture the practice itself, but we want to know what's changed. I mentioned the spiritual retreat study that we did. So we scan them, today, and then we send them through the retreat, and then they come back and we scan them again. And so, they're not actually doing the practices at all. We're trying to see the effect before and after.
Okay. I imagine the spec camera is much preferable to being in an fMRI machine with that high decibel whizzing in terms of, trying to recreate that spiritual practice.
Well, it is. That's part of why we use the SPECT
Mm.
scans a lot, because we could have the person in a room sitting up, maybe more quiet or something like that. and that allowed us to be able to, get a more natural setting
Right.
than being in the MRI scanner. And as you said, if anybody's been in an MRI scanner, they know it's very noisy, it's very uncomfortable. It is
Yeah.
not the easiest place to do a practice. And so, that in and of itself is an interesting issue and challenge that we have to think about. We have to think sometimes about, do we want people who are really experts at these practices, people who are relatively novice? It'd be nice to sort of see how people kind of develop their
Hmm. Hmm.
techniques and their practices, but maybe the novices are just so distracted by everything, whereas the highly expert people are able to do it irrespective of the MRI scanner or the other issues that are going on around them.
I imagine something else about neurotheology, differentiating it from other kinds of neuroscience, might be that there's a lot more opportunity, maybe a lot more need for interdisciplinary work. Do you ever talk to, collaborate with anthropologists, evolutionary studies, religious experts, etc.?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, I think neurotheology itself is a very multidisciplinary process. I actually talk about this a lot in my work. My original mentor in all of this was a physician who was a psychiatrist, but also had a PhD in anthropology. And so a number of our colleagues early on were anthropologists, and we would talk about the evolutionary forces and how rituals and so forth were connected with the human brain. In fact, one of the most recent books I just did was called Sex, God, and the Brain, and it talks a lot about the rituals of animals and how they ultimately kind of evolved into the rituals of human beings. But the interesting thing, and this was an area that my mentor, Dr. Eugene DeQuilly, was very involved in, wrote several books on rituals and animals. But the interesting thing about rituals and animals is that they're all mating rituals, and so it makes sense that the rituals that ultimately evolved into human beings are probably connected to mating processes themselves. And so the networks of the brain that we were talking about are also involved in sexuality and rituals, and help to sort of operate along similar lines. The rituals for mating help to identify, a potential mate, meaning identify a member of your group, and then also help you to come together with that member of the group. But that's exactly what the rituals and, in religion and spirituality and politics and sports and all that, it's about connect, who is part of my group, and how do I connect with that person, and sometimes connect with them very intimately. Anthropologists make are have an important role in all of this, and some of the most recent work that I'm doing um, is with individuals who really have even a greater background in religion and spirituality. My kind of next area of work has been the approaching specific traditions. So a lot of my work up until now has been kind of general discussions about religious and spiritual phenomena and beliefs and practices. Now we're kind of going the opposite direction, saying, okay, let's take a given tradition and try to analyze it from this neurotheological perspective. So it started with a book called The Rabbi's Brain, which was about Judaism, and that's my background. And I wrote that with a colleague who was an Orthodox rabbi by training. Just also published a book called Catholic Neurotheology with a nun who also has a PhD in anthropology.
Hmm.
And we're looking at some new projects, looking at the Muslim tradition, and also actually African indigenous religions as well. So it's a bit of an endless opportunity to explore all these kinds of things, but it's a lot of fun. It's very exciting, and I think it's fascinating, and I think it helps people to understand the nature of these different traditions, how they affect people, and as an idealistic person, I certainly hope that it helps us to kind of understand each other, understand the where our similarities are, and maybe learn about the uniqueness of each of these traditions. As I ultimately have said, one of the big take-home messages I always try to leave people with is that the uniqueness of each of our brains. I think every one of us kind of looks at religion and spirituality a little bit different. So even if you're sitting in a church or a mosque or whatever, the person sitting right next to you is not thinking about things exactly the same way. And so if there's, 8 billion people on the planet, I think there's 8 billion religions. And everybody kind of has a slightly different take on everything. Everyone has a slightly different prayer they feel is the most
Mhm.
important or their favorite. And the same is true for people who are non-religious. I don't think any two atheists are exactly the same, and certainly agnostics are not the same. So, there's a lot of different ways of people thinking about these things. And that to me is what a lot of this is about. And it's an interesting scientific challenge as well, because science tends to look at populations. So we want to get 100 people who are religious and compare them to 100 people who are not religious. But within that, there's so much variation that the ideal is to actually be able to break it down into the individual characteristics of each person. But then that makes it difficult to do from a statistical perspective. So,
Right, right.
so there's a lot for us to learn from each other.
Um, I I think you mentioned earlier that there's no specialized part of the brain that is dedicated to religion. Um, I'm wondering though, is it your belief that religion is an adaptive trait from an evolutionary point of view, or is it, as they say, a spandrel or a non-functional secondary byproduct?
Well, I certainly think it has adaptive elements to it. In fact, so the most recent book that I did publish on sex, God, and the brain tries to lay out that argument a little bit. I am open to all the perspectives, and certainly it is possible that it was, in addition to having an adaptive element, could have been somewhat epiphenomenal. But one of the arguments that I make in the new book is that it actually is adaptive, perhaps along the two aspects of adaptability when it comes to evolution. And people often forget about that, even though it's kind of right in front of us most of the time. But people think about evolution as survival of the fittest, and I think that certainly there's some good arguments to make for that. Of being, one of the intriguing uh, factoids that I always point out to people is that, at least as far as I'm aware I don't think there's ever been any civilization which has arisen de novo without religion and spirituality. I mean, I know, now we have some communist countries like China or whatever, the old Soviet Union, which like rejected religion. But if you look at every ancient tradition, every ancient civilization, they all had religions. So I think there's something to be said about the survival advantage of having a religious belief system that helps to create a cohesive society, provides a sense of morals, provides a sense of connectedness, helps people, handle catastrophes and bond together and fight off, outside threats and so forth. So I think that there's probably an adaptability to it. One of the other interesting anthropological arguments that I've often thought of and even kind of invoked in various ways was the old Stephen Jay Gould argument about, a half a wing doesn't fly. And so the idea is that, a wing didn't evolve with the sort of the conceived idea of becoming a wing. It had to be something else first, and then
Mhm.
eventually, it turned into a wing that could work. And then from there, it evolved as a wing. So, it is certainly possible that as our brain got bigger and began to think about all these things and began to think about spirituality and then kind of glommed onto that, it became an adaptive part of who we are from an evolutionary perspective. The other piece of the adaptability thing, which again, I try to emphasize here in Sex, God, and the Brain, is sexual selection, which is also, a kind of an equally important factor when it comes to the evolution of species. And, people are, I'm sure, familiar with that. These are, what create the big antlers and on the moose and the elk, the feathers on the peacock. And several people have made the interesting argument that the human brain itself evolved more out of sexual selection than out of adaptive natural selection, that it was our ability to communicate with each other, to have a sense of humor, to make music, to write poetry, and so forth, that our brains, males and females, co-evolved as a way through sexual selection. And so, spirituality and religion in many ways is an ultimate story that brings people together and creates social cohesiveness and so forth. And so, I strongly suspect that there is a sexual selection element as well as a natural selection element that is part of trying to understand how and why religious and spiritual belief systems became a part of humanity. Now, of course, in neurotheology, as I always argue, it's a two-way street. And so we have to kind of always be mindful of the religious answer as well. I mean, obviously, if there is a God, it makes sense that we would have a brain that is capable of prayer and meditation and understanding God. Otherwise, it'd be kind of fundamentally silly to have God up there and us down here, and we have no way of having an interaction with God. So, whether or not it ultimately is an evolutionary process, a religious process, or a divine process, or some combination of the two, the bottom line is that it's a part of who we are, and it certainly is a part of how our brain operates, how our body operates. That is something that I think can always be explored through this field of neurotheology.
Yes, I'm struck by how if a Martian came to my Buddhist Zendo and then went to a Roman Catholic church, I think the Martians would be convinced we're doing the same thing. This is called Gasho in Buddhism. It's called orans in a Roman Catholic church. There's kneeling, there's robes, there's incense, there's candles, there's an altar, there's chanting, singing. It seems like it's the shape of religion through many different uh, formulations is very similar.
Well, I agree, and again, I think neurotheology can help us make a fairly valid argument for that. I mean, if you look at all human beings across the planet, with I mean, obviously down to the neuronal level, we have distinctions, but if you look at our brains in general, they're pretty much all the same. I mean, we all have frontal lobes and temporal lobes and limbic systems, and they all kind of operate more or less the same. So, yeah, I mean, I think it would make sense that a lot of our ways of engaging religious and spiritual ideas would share a lot of overlap. And so, and part of that also, and gets back to this discussion about rituals. Rituals operate in many ways by taking advantage of our sensory processes. So every religious tradition, every spiritual tradition has visual imagery, visual symbols, and whether it's an image of a cross, an image of Buddha, whatever it is, there's something visual that we use because we're visual, and we're going to respond to that. We use our hearing, and whether that's a Gregorian chant, or whether it's listening to the other people in the ashram saying Om together, but we pick up on those sounds, that those rhythmic elements of the rituals that become part of that process. In fact, almost all of them engage rhythms in different ways. And why is that? Well, because that's how our brain works. Our brains work on the basis of rhythms. If you put an EEG cap on everyone's brain, there's tons of rhythms that are going across in electrical activity, and we
Hmm.
tap into that through these different rituals and these different processes. The specifics of it are always a little bit different,
Hmm.
but yes, there's no question that there's a lot of overlap. And I think, when we've done studies looking at the most profound spiritual experiences, and that includes from every tradition, we really can come up with some core elements of those experiences that really overlap with all of the traditions. I mean, almost every one of them includes some sense of oneness or connectedness. Now, whether you feel connected with your group, whether you feel connected with God, with the universe, with universal consciousness, whatever it is, could be a little bit different. But that sense of connectedness and oneness is something that is kind of fundamental. In fact, it kind of goes back to the mating process, that we have to, in order for mating to occur, you have to connect with another animal, and it doesn't work otherwise. So, so you have to look a lot at these kind of overlapping experiences and practices.
You had mentioned that, of course, many of the people you invite to your lab as subjects have different ideas about what is going on in their heads than you do. I'm wondering, what is their attitude? What kind of spirit do they come to the experiments? Is there any friction? What does that interaction look like?
Well, I mean, I've been very fortunate. I mean, first of all, as we've already kind of talked about a little bit, to me, this is all about understanding ourselves as human beings and how we are religious and spiritual. So it's never about getting rid of religion or getting rid of science or anything like that. It's about understanding, and I think for the most part, people appreciate that approach, that perspective that I try to take. And I start off right away saying, look, I'm not going to say, oh, this explains away your experiences, or this ends the need for having religion. It's really just, it's a way of us understanding how your particular practice or whatever it is that a person does has an impact not only on them spiritually, but biologically as well. And theoretically, it has to have a biological impact on them. For the most part, people have been pretty open to that. People are always interested in seeing what those differences are, what those changes are in the brain. I would say far and away, almost everyone who has come in has been appreciative. They are excited to see what the results are. They're intrigued by what it shows. They're intrigued by the similarities and differences between what they're doing and what other people are doing.
Hmm.
And look, I understand certainly that someone who is a deeply religious person may feel that while this could be interesting, it may have very little true impact on the ways in which they think about things or the ways in which they believe about things. But to me, I forget who put it. I thought a really neat way. Even if you're a religious individual and you think about God as your parent, and so if you're a parent and your kid is, and you give the kid a toy and they're taking it apart to see how it works, you'd be pretty excited as a parent. And I think, they said, well, wouldn't God be kind of, similarly interested to watch us try to understand who we are and to kind of take
Hmm.
ourselves apart and see, the incredible workings that make us who we are. So yeah, so I've been very fortunate. I think for the most part, we've had very good, people come in with very positive attitudes about things. And interestingly, and this has always been kind of our little joke, that we're always a little worried about, is it possible that people aren't going to be able to do the practice as well or whatever. And for the most part, I think because people are so kind of keyed in on doing it and engaged and so forth, a lot of times people describe to us that they actually have more intense experiences
Ah.
than they have in their usual setting, because they're just really hyper focused on making sure it works and it goes well. It's kind of funny, but I think in general, we've been very lucky. But those are questions that we also do talk to them about. We want to find out, what are you doing, how are you doing it, and then after they go through this, I'm always, my first question is, how did it go? Did it work? Was it something that was useful and helpful? Were you able to engage it the way you normally are? Because obviously, if I think they've done a prayer session well and they're like, no, it didn't go well, then I can't really use that data, and I can't really
Hmm.
say that what I found is accurate in terms of reflecting what's going on in their brain when they do the practice. So again, this is something that I talk about a lot in the principles of neurotheology, which is the phenomenology of these experiences, trying to understand them, trying to understand what the person is doing, and really trying to figure out how that ties into whatever it is that you're looking at, but doing the best to kind of combine that phenomenological with whatever is kind of more biological, so that we get the clearest picture as to what's going on.
Did you come to this research with any religious feelings or intuitions?
Well, I mean, a lot of my interest in this whole area grew out of, I think, almost more of a philosophical perspective, which was trying to understand the nature of reality. You've kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, that, people coming from different traditions. And I always thought, well, why are we looking at the world differently? I mean, if we're all looking at the same world, then how come we don't all have the same spiritual beliefs, political beliefs, moral beliefs, and so forth? And because clearly we don't. And so that to me was always kind of the fundamental driving question: what's going on when it comes to these experiences and beliefs? And early on, one of the ideas that I had was this idea that, well, theoretically, if you really wanted to know if what you believed on the inside was accurate with what's going on the outside, you'd have to somehow jump outside of your brain and look at what's actually out there and say, okay, this is what's actually out there. This is what I think on the inside, and do they match up? And then you'd kind of know that what you were looking at was accurate. Well, unfortunately, there's no way to jump outside of your brain, or is there? And that was always why I was kind of intrigued as I started to learn about various mystical experiences that people in those experiences actually make a statement where they say, "Oh, gee, yeah, I actually get beyond myself. I get beyond my consciousness. I get beyond my ego." Whatever, different terms that people use. Now, I'm not saying that they do, but it is at least the only um, type of experience that I'm aware of where people actually say that kind of a thing. And so, that's part of what drew me into trying to study these experiences and trying to understand them, what they mean, and how we can understand them from a biological perspective as well as from a spiritual one. And a lot of my investigation into this question about the nature of reality really started with this idea of how does our brain process this information. I thought that was kind of fundamentally important for us to look at. But then over time, I did realize that as wonderful as science is, that there are questions and issues that seem to kind of go beyond or evade science a little bit, like the discussion about consciousness and where consciousness is and what that means. And again, even some of these big epistemological questions about the nature of reality. So I began to really feel that we need to find an approach that combines science and the philosophical, spiritual, and so forth. And that to me is how I kind of landed into the neurotheology, which again, to really emphasize, it's not just science looking at religion, and it's also not just religion looking at science, but it's kind of the two of them looking at each other and trying to help us understand who we are as human beings and how we experience reality. And, can that get us to a better answer to that fundamental question? And I haven't gotten to the answer yet, but I feel like the journey has been worthwhile, and I've learned a great deal, and which hopefully other people have as well. And hopefully at some point, I can get to that fundamental answer as to, when people have, a mystical experience, does it really represent the fundamental reality, and what does that mean for us as human beings?
So you seem like a person that strives for objectivity. So I want to share with you something I've been thinking about, and maybe you can help me. Maybe you can illuminate the issue. Uh,
I'll try.
I'm attracted to your work because I'm a universalist, and I think sometimes you dig in that vein. You
Sure.
you indicate things that are saying that we are all alike as humans, or similar, and that I guess I can kind of look at that and say, okay, that is sort of a bias, and I don't want to let that get away from me. But then lately, I've also been thinking, in law, they have a different model for truth. They have these lawyers that are advocates and that are just looking at one side of the argument and being passionate advocates of it. And it makes me
Right.
think, well, look, that bias, that might have some ethical force, that might be a true intuition, that might give me some energy. So I guess what I'm coming down is somewhere in the middle, but I'm wondering if that resonates for you and how you think about that.
Well, I mean, you kind of bring up a couple of interesting points, and some of this actually we addressed in an earlier book I did called "Why We Believe What We Believe," where we do, I spend a lot of time actually talking about all the different biases that we have, and trying to acknowledge. I mean, to some degree, again, like you can't get past your biases because they're your biases. You can try to be aware of them and things like that. But in being aware of them, then your bias. I mean, you get into these very circular kinds of arguments. Part of what I think is important for me is to be able to try to explore. Um, all those different beliefs, not only in others, but certainly in myself as well. And so, I do try to be aware as best as I can about, my own perspectives and biases and beliefs that I hold. I know that they have an impact on the way I look at things. I try to explore the way, other people embrace their religious and spiritual traditions, and try to make sense out of that. But that to me is also kind of another exciting part of neurotheology, because there's the ability to kind of look at the level of the experiences and the practices and the beliefs that we hold, but there is this sort of like meta level piece as well, which is, how do we think about the ways in which we think about these things? And so,
Hmm.
why is it that we have a brain that can ask these questions, and how does it, how does our brain engage these larger discussions? So it gives you, it's a very multi-layered approach. It always brings up the issues and the challenges that all of us face, and trying to be aware of the various biases that each of us hold. That as much as I try to be aware of them, I realize that it's always going to be a potential limitation in terms of how I think about certain things, which again is true for everyone. So, but again, that to me is where I hope that neurotheology provides some interesting perspectives that kind of teaches us about the beliefs and the biases that each person holds, and maybe makes us appreciate where we're all coming from. I mean, ultimately we're all kind of inside this brain that's looking out on an infinite world and doing its best to figure it out. And our brain is very flawed, it's very finite. And so, I'm always intrigued by how confident people can be about their own ideas about the world. And I'm thinking, like you have access to like point
Right.
zero zero and fill in another 10,000 zeros, 1% of what's going on in this universe, and yet somehow you think you understand it. It's pretty remarkable how our brain does that for us and helps us to do that. And again, that to me is something that I hope the field of neurotheology kind of brings out for people. But it's unnerving by the same token, because obviously if we don't understand the world, then that's a very precarious place to be, and our brain doesn't want to be in that position either. So we like to feel like we know what's going on, even though we may really not.
Let me share with you something that I read in your work and that kind of connected with my practice. You
Yeah.
talk about the rhythms. In fact, during our talk, you did, and and you write about how it kind of affects our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Sympathetic
Right.
is a fight or flight kind of response. The parasympathetic is a rest and digest. One kind of arouses you, and the other one kind of brings you down. And you said that sometimes putting those two things together has a particular result, right? A particular
Sure.
effect. Well,
Right.
in Zen Buddhist practice, there's a chant called Enmei Juku Kanon Gyo, and the Ino is doing this chant in Japanese, and it starts out slow. It's Gansei on nama butsuyo butsu, like that. But
Mm.
then
Right.
you repeat it many times, and pretty soon you're going
Mm.
like at the speed of a pharmaceutical
Fast.
commercial disclaimer, Gansei on nama butsu, and you're affected by this rhythm. You're getting short of breath, and
Right.
it's just kind of bringing you to a kind of a peak, and then it starts slowing down, slowing down, slowing down, and then it ends, and
Right.
they leave you in meditation. And some of the
Yeah.
most beautiful meditations from retreat are at that moment. Um,
Mm.
I'm wondering if you have any other thoughts or insights into why that happens, or how that happens.
Well, this ties together a lot of the things that we've talked about. I mean, the autonomic nervous system, as you mentioned, the sympathetic or arousal, and the parasympathetic or the calming system. I think plays a very prominent role when it comes to religious and spiritual rituals, certainly, and experiences as well. And it's one of the things that I've kind of delineated in my work has been the different uh, permutations of that, so to speak. So you can have just a purely arousal state, and it can be a very highly energized, like Sufi dancing kind of thing. You can have a deeply calm state, a deeply blissful state, and then you can have those combination states, as you mentioned, where it can be either working up on one side and then bringing in the other, where you can even have kind of a simultaneity of them, a kind of an active bliss, so to speak. So you're highly aroused, but you also have a strong sense of blissfulness. And so yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the different kinds of experiences that people have can be evaluated from that perspective. And again, that's not the sum total of those experiences, but I think it's an important part. And what's interesting about that is severalfold. One is that this is how our brain connects to our body. So when you are doing the chanting in from the brain, it's you're feeling it. You're not just saying it, but you're feeling it all the way through your body, and the autonomic nervous system connects to basically every part of every organ, every muscle. And so it's really part of that whole process. But one other interesting caveat goes back to my point about the connection between spirituality and sexuality, because it turns out also that mating, and particularly the mating having sex and orgasm, involves both arms of the autonomic nervous system, and that's
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of overlap there, and again, I think there's a lot of different permutations of that. It can be, a lot of arousal and a little bit of calming. It can be, kind of the same amount. It can be the other way. So there's a lot of different ways in which that can ultimately be affected within people, but and tweaked, so to speak, by the rituals, depending on what the goal is, what you're trying to do, and whether the end goal is some kind of deeply calm state, deeply aroused state, some combination of the two. But yeah, that's a very important part of the whole process, and I think helps us to understand that physiological connection between the brain and body, and ultimately the spiritual practices that people do.
One last question. We've talked a lot about religion, but I know you have many other research interests. What are you working on now?
Well, I do continue to study all the different practices. As I mentioned, one of the interesting kind of global projects that I'm working on is to try to engage each of the different traditions. So looking to, look at Buddhism, Hinduism, indigenous religions, a whole variety of different practices and traditions. I think that'll be very exciting. I've been working in the field of integrative medicine. So beyond just sort of spirituality, we understand the person in a multidimensional way, thinking about our biology, our psychology, the social connections that we have. And so we are studying a variety of conditions and issues, and how we can try to help people through diet and nutrition, through various antioxidants, anti-inflammatories, as well as the different mind-body practices that can all be a part of a person's life, so that we can try to keep people as happy and healthy for as long as possible. And so it kind of combines some of this work with the medical side of things as well. But that's the beauty of medicine. There's the beauty of research. There's always another question. In fact, there's usually thousands of other questions, and I hope to continue to look at it. We'll be looking at, again, even going back to the spirituality piece, we'll be looking at the effects of different disorders with regard to various beliefs and experiences, psychedelics. It kind of goes on and on. There's just so many different ways of trying to get at how these experiences affect people, and how they intersect with who we are.
Andrew Newberg, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.